Some men spend their entire lives without realizing what it feels like to become invisible inside a home they work tirelessly to build. I know that feeling all too well, but I refuse to live with it anymore. My name is David Morgan. I'm 53 years old, and for over 3 decades, I dedicated my life to creating something meaningful. I built a successful contracting business from the ground up, raised a family, and turned a simple house into a place filled with memories. My weekends were spent coaching my son's baseball games, repairing broken fences, and making sure my family never had to wonder if I would show up. I never expected applause or recognition. That's how I was raised. You work hard, keep your promises, and provide for the people you love. What no one ever tells you is that sometimes the people you've sacrificed everything for quietly decide your efforts no longer matter. The story truly began the afternoon my son, Caleb, introduced us to the woman he wanted to marry. My wife, Elizabeth, and I were relaxing on the back porch when Caleb pulled into the driveway. As he stepped out of his car, a young woman followed behind him. The first thing I noticed wasn't her appearance, it was the confidence she carried. She walked as though every room already belonged to her before she entered it. She greeted me with a polite handshake. "I'm Lily Chen," she said with a practiced smile. "I've heard so much about you." Her words sounded friendly enough, but something about them felt rehearsed. She already knew exactly who I was before I had the chance to introduce myself. "I hope you've only heard good things," I replied with a smile. "Of course," she answered. At the time, I believed her. Looking back now, that smile would become the most expensive smile I'd ever encounter. Caleb had always been a good kid. He wasn't perfect. He could be stubborn and sometimes a little too trusting, but he had a genuinely kind heart. He worked hard, respected his mother, and never forgot to call home every Sunday. When he told us he was in love, I believed every word. When he said Lily was the woman he wanted to spend the rest of his life with, I supported him without hesitation. Still, there was one thing that quietly bothered me. Every time Lily looked around our house, it wasn't with admiration. It felt more like she was evaluating everything she saw, silently deciding what measured up and what didn't. During her first dinner with us, she complimented our kitchen before casually asking if we'd remodeled recently, or if it had simply become outdated. Elizabeth laughed and explained that the kitchen was original. Lily nodded thoughtfully, almost as if she'd expected that answer. I poured myself another glass of wine and let the conversation continue, convincing myself I was reading too much into it. 8 months later, Caleb called with exciting news. He had proposed. Elizabeth burst into tears of happiness. I congratulated him immediately because, despite my reservations, seeing my son happy mattered more than anything else. Wedding preparations began almost overnight. Within the first couple of weeks, I received my first glimpse of what those months would become. It wasn't about money, not yet. It was about respect. Elizabeth and I visited Caleb and Lily one evening to discuss the wedding plans. We brought a bottle of wine and expected a relaxed conversation. Instead, Lily arrived carrying a thick color-coded binder filled with schedules, venue brochures, budget sheets, and carefully organized tabs. It looked less like wedding planning and more like a corporate business presentation. She confidently slid a brochure across the table. "We've completely fallen in love with this venue," she said. I picked it up, admired the beautiful photographs, then quietly turned it over and noticed the price. Something told me this was only the beginning. As I studied the venue brochure, I couldn't help noticing the price printed neatly on the back page. It was enough to make anyone pause for a second. Still, I kept my thoughts to myself and simply nodded. "It's a beautiful place," I admitted. Lily smiled confidently, almost as though she'd expected my approval. "I knew you'd like it," she replied. We're thinking about reserving the full weekend package so our guests can enjoy the entire experience. Elizabeth leaned forward with genuine curiosity. How many guests are you planning to invite? Oh, around 280, Lily answered without hesitation. I nearly choked on my sip of wine. 280, I repeated. She nodded. My parents have friends from work, my mom has people from church, there are cousins, college friends, business contacts. She explained casually, flipping through another page of her binder. I looked toward Caleb. And how many of those are actually people you two know well? He shifted uncomfortably before answering. I guess, maybe 60 or 70. The math didn't make much sense to me. So most of the guest list isn't even for the bride and groom. Lily gave me the same polished smile I'd seen the day we first met. Weddings are about creating memories, Mr. Morgan. I simply nodded. Of course they are. There wasn't much point arguing. The plans were already taking shape, and I could tell every detail had been decided long before this meeting. What surprised me wasn't the size of the wedding. It was how quickly every expense somehow found its way onto my side of the table. At first it seemed harmless. There was the venue deposit. Then the catering estimate. A florist consultation that somehow turned into an extravagant floral package, costing thousands more than anyone had expected. Next came the photographer. Apparently, according to one of Lily's closest friends, there was only one photographer good enough for a wedding like this. Every recommendation came with the same explanation. We don't want to regret cutting corners. Every time another invoice appeared, Lily would glance toward Caleb. Caleb would quietly look at me. Then Elizabeth would gently place her hand on my arm. She never pressured me with words. She didn't have to. After 31 years of marriage, I understood that touch perfectly. It said, if we can help our son, we should. And every single time, I agreed. Weeks passed faster than I expected. One check became another. Then another. By the third month of planning, I'd already written checks totaling more than $40,000. I remember sitting alone in my office one evening, opening my banking app just to double-check the numbers. $41,000. It wasn't that I couldn't afford it. Years of hard work had allowed Elizabeth and me to live comfortably. The money wasn't the problem. The problem was that gratitude seemed to disappear a little more every week. Early on, Lily would thank me after every payment. Eventually, the thank yous became shorter. Then they became expected. Finally, they disappeared altogether. It was as if everyone quietly assumed I would keep paying no matter what. Maybe they were right. At least for a while. Those 6 months taught me more about people than the previous 30 years had. Whenever I offered a suggestion, Lily would smile politely before explaining why another option was better. If Elizabeth shared an opinion about flowers, decorations, or the menu, Lily would listen carefully, nod in agreement, and then move forward with her original decision anyway. Everything looked collaborative on the surface. In reality, every major decision had already been made. Caleb rarely challenged any of it. He seemed completely caught up in making sure everyone stayed happy, especially Lily. Watching him slowly give up his own opinions bothered me more than I admitted. Then there was Lily's younger sister, Madison. She arrived early to nearly every planning meeting, making sure everyone understood Lily's vision before discussions even began. Unlike Lily, Madison was surprisingly easy to talk to. She was organized, calm, and knew exactly how to smooth over awkward conversations. One afternoon during a cake tasting, she smiled at me and said, "Mr. Morgan, Lily really appreciates your involvement." I chuckled as I sampled a tiny piece of cake that probably cost more per slice than entire birthday cakes I'd bought growing up. I'm sure she does. Madison laughed politely. She just has a very specific picture in her mind. I've been married for over 30 years, I replied with a grin. I know exactly what that means. For the first time since this whole process had started, someone laughed with me instead of at me. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wedding wasn't bringing our families together. It was quietly teaching me exactly where I stood. The week before the wedding, Lily's father finally arrived from Arizona. His name was Brooks Turner, and I'd only met him a couple of times before. The first was at the engagement party, and the second was during a family dinner Lily had carefully organized months earlier. Brooks carried himself with quiet confidence. He spoke calmly, dressed impeccably, and had the kind of presence that naturally commanded attention. After spending decades as a successful corporate attorney, he looked like a man who had spent his life making important decisions. One thing caught my attention almost immediately. Throughout the entire wedding week, he never once mentioned helping with the expenses. Not once. He checked into the hotel using the room block that had been included in the wedding package, one that I had already paid for. He enjoyed every event, greeted guests warmly, and proudly embraced his role as the bride's father. I wasn't angry. At least, that's what I kept telling myself. On the night before the wedding, Elizabeth noticed I had become unusually quiet. "You've got something on your mind," she said as we settled into our hotel room. "I've just been thinking," I replied. "About Brooks." I nodded. He never offered to contribute. Elizabeth sighed gently. "David, not everyone looks at these things the same way." "I know," I answered. "I'm simply making an observation." She smiled knowingly. "That observation sounds a lot like frustration." I laughed softly. "I think I passed frustration somewhere around $40,000 ago." She leaned over and kissed my cheek. "Just 2 more days," she whispered. I nodded. 2 more days. The rehearsal dinner was held at an elegant restaurant downtown. Once again, I picked up the bill without mentioning it. The evening itself was wonderful. Caleb stood to give a speech that had everyone emotional, especially Elizabeth, who wiped away tears before he'd even finished thanking us. Brooks followed with a heartfelt speech about Lily's childhood, her determination, and how proud he was of the woman she'd become. It was beautifully delivered. Still, I couldn't help noticing that our family wasn't mentioned once. Madison gave a toast that had the entire room laughing, including me. For a brief moment, everything felt normal. As the evening came to an end, Lily walked over and smiled warmly. "Thank you for everything, David," she said sincerely. For the first time in months, I believed every word. Maybe I judged her too harshly. Maybe all the stress of planning had simply brought out the worst in everyone. The wedding morning arrived beneath a clear September sky. The venue looked breathtaking. White roses spilled from elegant arrangements, while deep burgundy flowers decorated every aisle and table. The estate looked like something from a magazine. Elizabeth quietly admired the floral displays. "I can't believe it's finally here," she whispered. "So can I," I replied. Despite everything, I wanted the day to be perfect for Caleb. When it was time for the ceremony, I walked beside my son. He looked nervous. "Dad," he said quietly before we reached the front, "I just want you to know." I placed a hand on his shoulder. "You don't have to explain." He smiled. "I know." The ceremony itself was beautiful. Watching my son exchange vows filled me with pride, even though my feelings toward Lily remained complicated. At that moment, none of that mattered. Caleb looked genuinely happy. That was enough for me. After the ceremony ended, guests made their way toward the reception hall. I expected the celebration to continue exactly as the day had begun. Instead, everything changed in less than 5 minutes. The reception ballroom was divided into 2 seating areas. The main floor held dozens of beautifully decorated round tables surrounding the dance floor. Off to one side was a slightly elevated platform, with a handful of larger tables that overlooked the entire room. At first, I assumed the raised section was simply part of the venue's design. An usher escorted Elizabeth and me to table 7. We thanked him and sat down. Then I looked around. Every name at our table belonged to Lily's extended family. I glanced toward the elevated platform. The largest centerpiece in the room stood on the table overlooking everyone else. Elizabeth quietly followed my gaze. Something didn't feel right. "I'll check the seating chart," she said softly. A minute later she returned. Her expression said everything before she spoke. "Who's sitting up there?" I asked. She hesitated. "Lily's college friends, her sorority sisters, and several of her closest guests." I looked back toward the platform. "So the people who paid for this wedding." I stopped speaking. We were sitting at table 7. And somehow, complete strangers had been given the seats of honor. For the first time that entire day, I felt something inside me quietly begin to change. For a few seconds, I stayed exactly where I was. I wasn't angry. I wasn't about to make a scene. In fact, I was surprisingly calm. Elizabeth reached across the table and gently touched my hand. "David," she whispered, "let's not let this ruin Caleb's day." "I'm not going to," I answered quietly. I stood up, buttoned my jacket, and walked toward the wedding coordinator. She was a pleasant woman wearing a headset while checking guests into their assigned tables. "Excuse me," I said politely. "I'm David Morgan, the groom's father. I think there may have been a mistake with our seating." She smiled professionally and glanced at her clipboard. "David Morgan." Her finger moved down the list. "Yes, sir, table 7. I smiled politely. "I actually came from table 7. I'm wondering if perhaps our place cards were switched with another table." She checked again. Then she looked up at me with the same polite expression. "No, sir, everything is exactly as requested." "As requested?" "Yes." She hesitated before continuing. "The seating chart was finalized by the bride several days ago." There it was. No mistake. No misunderstanding. Exactly as planned. I thanked her for her help and calmly walked back to my seat. Elizabeth looked into my eyes before I even sat down. "It wasn't an accident, was it?" I slowly shook my head. "No." Neither of us spoke for the next several minutes. The music continued. Guests laughed. Servers moved gracefully between the tables carrying trays of champagne. From the outside, it looked like a perfect wedding reception. Inside, something had shifted. I watched as Lily's college friends enjoyed the elevated seating area with the best view in the room. Meanwhile, Elizabeth and I sat quietly among relatives we'd barely spoken to all day. It wasn't about having the best table. It was about what that seating arrangement represented. The people who had financed nearly every detail of this wedding had been quietly moved into the background. I tried convincing myself to let it go. It's only a table, I thought. Don't ruin your son's wedding over something so small. For nearly 40 minutes, I managed exactly that. I smiled when relatives stopped by. I congratulated Caleb whenever he passed our table. I even laughed at a joke one of the waiters made while serving dinner. Then Lily walked over. She looked absolutely radiant in her wedding dress, holding a champagne glass as she made her way from table to table thanking guests. When she reached ours, she leaned down beside me. Her smile never faded. Her voice remained soft enough that only I could hear. "I hope you're comfortable, David." "I am," I replied politely. She nodded. "I'm glad." Then she added something I'll never forget. "I just wanted to remind you that the seating near the head table is reserved for the wedding party and our VIP guests." I looked at her, unsure I'd heard correctly. She continued speaking in the same pleasant tone. "So if you could just enjoy the evening from here, that would be wonderful." I stared at her. "I'm here as a guest," I said slowly. She smiled again. "Exactly." Then she repeated the words that would echo in my mind for months. "You're here as a guest." She straightened her dress, wished us a wonderful evening, and walked back toward the head table without waiting for a response. I sat perfectly still. For 15 long seconds, I didn't move. I didn't speak. I simply watched her disappear into the crowd. Elizabeth noticed immediately. "What did she say?" I picked up my fork and calmly took another bite of my salad before answering. "She reminded me that I'm a guest." Elizabeth slowly lowered her fork. "David." I forced a small smile. "It's all right." But it wasn't. Not because of where I was sitting. Not because of the expensive wedding I'd paid for. It was because, in that single sentence, Lily had erased 6 months of sacrifices as though none of them had ever mattered. Something inside me quietly shut down at that moment. Not with anger. Not with shouting. Just silence. The kind of silence that comes when a person finally understands exactly where they stand in someone else's life. For the rest of the evening, I watched Caleb from across the room. He laughed with friends, greeted relatives, and danced with his new wife. Yet every now and then, our eyes met. Each time, he looked away just a little too quickly. There was guilt in his expression. He knew something wasn't right. Maybe he knew about the seating arrangement. Maybe he didn't. Either way, he never came over. And I never called him. Instead, I quietly finished my meal, applauded every speech, smiled for every photograph, and played the role Lily had assigned me. A guest. What she didn't realize was that those 3 simple words had changed everything. She thought she was describing my place at her wedding. In reality, she had just defined the future of our relationship. Neither of us knew it yet. But the consequences of those words were only beginning. Around 9 o'clock that evening, I quietly excused myself from the reception. "I need a little fresh air," I told Elizabeth. She looked at me with concern, but simply nodded. "I'll be inside if you need me." I stepped out onto the stone terrace overlooking the gardens. The evening was cool, and soft lights illuminated the rows of white roses and deep burgundy flowers surrounding the estate. It truly was a breathtaking venue. Ironically, every beautiful detail around me had been paid for with checks I had written over the previous 6 months. Nearly $58,000. The number replayed in my mind as I stared across the gardens. A few minutes later, I heard footsteps behind me. Beautiful night, isn't it? I turned and saw Brooks Turner holding a glass of whiskey. "It certainly is," I replied. For a while, we simply stood there in silence, watching guests laugh through the ballroom windows. Finally, Brooks spoke again. "Lily can be difficult sometimes." I looked at him. He gave a tired smile. "She's always been determined. Once she decides she wants something, she rarely changes her mind." "That's one way to describe it," I answered. He chuckled quietly. "My late wife used to call it ambition." "And what do you call it now?" I asked. Brooks looked down at the drink in his hand before answering. "Expensive." For the first time all evening, I laughed. A real laugh. He joined me. Then his expression grew serious. I probably should have contributed more to this wedding. I met his eyes. Yes, I said honestly. You probably should have. He didn't argue. He simply nodded, finished his drink, and headed back inside. I remained on the terrace for several more minutes. Not because I was upset. Because I was thinking. When Elizabeth and I finally returned to our hotel room later that night, she immediately sensed something had changed. You've barely spoken since dinner, she said as she sat beside me. I've been doing some thinking. About Lily. I slowly nodded. No. She looked surprised. I'm thinking about myself. What do you mean? I leaned back in the chair and folded my hands. Tonight wasn't about where we sat. I know, Elizabeth replied softly. It was about what she believes. And what does she believe? She believes my role is over. Elizabeth remained silent. I continued. I gave them the wedding they wanted. I did it because I love Caleb. I never expected praise. But being told I'm just a guest at an event I paid for. I paused. That tells me exactly how she sees me. Elizabeth reached for my hand. So what are you going to do? I looked out the hotel window for a long moment before answering. Nothing. She frowned slightly. Nothing. Not tonight. I wasn't interested in revenge. I wasn't planning an argument. I certainly wasn't going to embarrass my son on his wedding day. Those opportunities had already passed. But something else had become crystal clear. I'm a builder. I've spent my entire life creating businesses, homes, and opportunities. And anyone who knows how to build something also understands another important truth. You can choose when to stop building. That night before going to bed, I picked up my phone and opened the Notes app. I typed only 2 words. My reply. Nothing else. No explanation. No anger. Just 2 simple words reminding myself that, when the right moment arrived, I already knew exactly how I would respond. That moment came sooner than I expected. 31 days later. Caleb and Lily had just returned from a 2-week honeymoon in Italy. Unlike the wedding, they had paid for that trip themselves, and I genuinely respected them for it. 3 days after they got home, my phone rang while I was sitting in my office reviewing paperwork. The caller ID displayed Lily's name. Not Caleb's. Lily's. I answered. Hello, David, she said cheerfully. I hope I'm not interrupting anything. Not at all, I replied. She sounded relaxed, happy, and refreshed from her vacation. We've been going over our finances since we got back, she began. You know how expensive weddings can be. They certainly can, I agreed. She laughed lightly. Exactly. Caleb and I have been talking about taking another trip sometime next year. We've always dreamed of visiting Japan. There was a brief pause. Then she continued. We were wondering, since you've already been so incredibly generous, if you'd be willing to help us a little with that trip too. I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I looked at the 2 words still saved in my phone. My reply. The moment I had prepared for had finally arrived. I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I let the silence settle between us. On the other end of the line, Lily waited patiently, probably expecting me to say yes the way I always had during the wedding planning. David, she asked after a few seconds, are you still there? I'm here, I replied calmly. I've actually been expecting this conversation. There was a brief pause. Oh, she said, sounding slightly confused. Yes. I leaned back in my office chair and looked around the room where I had signed dozens of checks over the past 6 months. Every invoice, every deposit, every payment had passed through this very desk. "Lily," I began, "do you remember what you said to me at the wedding reception?" Silence. I'm not sure what you mean." "I remember it very clearly," I continued. "You walked over to table 7, leaned down beside me, and reminded me that I was there as a guest." She didn't interrupt. "You even said it twice." Another long silence followed. Finally she spoke. "I didn't mean it the way you're making it sound." "I haven't changed your words," I replied quietly. "I'm simply remembering them." Her voice became noticeably more serious. "David, if this is about the seating arrangement, I think there's been a misunderstanding." "No," I said gently. "There hasn't." I wasn't angry. I wasn't trying to punish her. I was simply responding to exactly what she had told me. "You explained that I was a guest," I continued, "and after thinking about it, I realized you were right." She sounded confused. "What do you mean?" "I mean guests don't pay for second honeymoons." The line went completely silent. "So," she finally whispered. "So my answer is no." Just one word. No. Nothing more. She let out a slow breath. "That's really your final answer?" "It is." "I honestly can't believe this." "I can." She tried again. "I thought after everything you've already done for us." "I have done everything I intended to do. But it's just a contribution. I've already made my contribution." She hesitated before speaking again. "I think you're overreacting." I smiled to myself. "I don't think I am. This feels unfair." "I disagree. You know Caleb was excited about this trip. I hope the two of you are able to save for it." Another long silence. Finally she said quietly, "I'm going to tell Caleb about this." "I think you should." "You do?" "Absolutely. He deserves to hear both sides." Without raising my voice, I added one final sentence. "I'd be happy to have that conversation with my son." She didn't respond. A moment later, the call ended. I slowly placed my phone on the desk. I wasn't shaking. My heart wasn't racing. I didn't feel guilty. Instead, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Peace. Not because I denied the money. Because, for the first time since the wedding planning had begun, I'd finally established a boundary. About 3 hours later, my phone rang again. This time it was Caleb. I answered immediately. "Dad." His voice sounded disappointed. "I just talked to Lily. I assumed you would." He sighed heavily. "She said you refused to help us." "I did." "I don't understand." "Then ask me." There was another pause. "I don't think this is really about the vacation." "It isn't." "Then what is it about?" "It's about respect." He stayed quiet. "Dad, I paid for your wedding because I love you." "I know. I never expected repayment." "I know. But I will not be treated like an outsider at an event I financed, and then be expected to continue writing checks as though nothing happened." She didn't mean to hurt you. I closed my eyes. "Caleb." "Yes." She reminded me twice that I was only a guest. He didn't answer. That wasn't an accident. Another long silence filled the call. Finally, he spoke again. "So you're cutting us off?" "No. I'm closing my wallet." "There's a difference. I'll always be your father. If you need advice, I'm here. If you need help fixing your roof, call me. If you want to come over for dinner on Sunday, Your mother's already planning your favorite corn salad. But I'm no longer going to solve every financial problem that comes along. He didn't argue. He simply said, I need some time to think. I understand. After we hung up, I wasn't sure what would happen next. Maybe Caleb would stay angry. Maybe Lily would convince him I was being selfish. Maybe I damaged our relationship forever. But one thing was certain. The man who had quietly accepted every request without question no longer existed. And although I didn't know it yet, saying one simple word had started a chain of events that would change all of our lives. Sunday arrived exactly as it always had. The smell of charcoal filled the backyard while Elizabeth prepared her famous corn salad in the kitchen. I wasn't sure Caleb would actually come after our phone conversation, but just after noon, his truck pulled into the driveway. He came alone. I didn't ask where Lily was. He didn't offer an explanation. Instead, we spent the afternoon grilling burgers, watching football, and talking about everything except the wedding. It reminded me of the years before he got married, when our biggest disagreement was whether his favorite team would finally make the playoffs. By the time he left that evening, nothing had been resolved. But nothing had gotten worse either. Sometimes, silence is more healing than another argument. Over the next few weeks, however, Lily wasn't nearly as willing to let the issue go. She called Elizabeth several times. Each conversation sounded almost identical. According to Lily, I had always been controlling. She claimed I used money to influence people. She insisted I had embarrassed her by refusing to help with the trip after everything we'd supposedly done, as a family. Elizabeth listened politely every time. When the calls ended, she would walk into my office, sit down across from me, and quietly shake her head. She's trying to rewrite what happened, she said one afternoon. I know. Caleb is stuck in the middle. I know that too. She looked at me carefully. So, are you going to respond? I smiled. I already have. She frowned slightly. What do you mean? I said no. And that's enough. There was no reason to argue with someone who had already decided what the truth should look like. The facts didn't need defending. The wedding bills existed. The checks existed. And so did the memory of Table 7. What I hadn't told anyone, not even Elizabeth, was what I had done the morning after the wedding. While she was still asleep in our hotel room, I'd stepped into the lobby with a cup of coffee and made one important phone call. Not to Caleb. Not to Lily. To my accountant. Stephanie had managed my business finances for more than a decade. She was exceptionally organized, incredibly discreet, and never asked unnecessary questions. Good morning, David, she answered. What can I do for you? I want a complete review of everything. Everything. Every business account. Every investment. Every property. And every document that lists beneficiaries. She paused only long enough to write everything down. When would you like me to start? Immediately. She never asked why. That's one of the reasons I'd trusted her for so many years. Over the next several weeks, Stephanie reviewed every financial record I owned. Once she finished, I met with my attorney. Together, we began restructuring nearly everything I'd spent my lifetime building. My contracting company, the business I had started with nothing more than an old pickup truck, a toolbox, and years of determination, was transferred into a carefully designed trust. The trust protected the company, while ensuring Elizabeth would always be financially secure. After her lifetime, Caleb would eventually inherit everything. But there was one important condition. The inheritance would only pass to him if there was no evidence that anyone had manipulated or pressured him financially through marriage or undue influence. When my attorney suggested adding that clause, I raised an eyebrow. Isn't that a little excessive? He folded his hands across the desk. No, it's protective. You spent decades building this company. You have every right to protect it. After thinking about it for several minutes, I signed the paperwork. That wasn't the only change. Our home, the house Elizabeth and I had spent 20 years renovating together, was legally transferred into her name alone. The same house Lily had once casually described as a little dated. I wasn't acting out of revenge. I wasn't trying to punish anyone. I simply understood something that had become impossible to ignore. Building a life requires years. Losing it can happen surprisingly fast if you leave the wrong doors open. Lily had shown me exactly how she viewed generosity. To her, every gift became an expectation. Every sacrifice became an obligation. I couldn't predict what request would come next. Maybe another vacation. Maybe help buying a larger house. Maybe something even bigger. But one thing was certain. The answer would never again depend on guilt. Everything I had worked for was now protected. Not because I stopped loving my son, but because loving someone doesn't mean leaving everything you've built unguarded. For the first time since the wedding, I finally felt prepared for whatever came next. And as it turned out, the next move would come from a lawyer. Almost 4 months passed without any major confrontation. Life slowly settled into a routine. Caleb still visited from time to time, though more often than not he came alone. Elizabeth and I never questioned him about Lily. We figured if he wanted to talk, he would. Until then, we simply enjoyed having our son around. Then one Monday morning, an envelope arrived from a law office. My assistant placed it on my desk. It came by certified mail, she said. I thanked her and opened it. The letter came from an attorney representing Lily. I read it once. Then I read it again. By the third time, I still couldn't believe what I was seeing. According to the letter, because I had voluntarily financed such a large portion of the wedding, there might now be an ongoing financial responsibility to continue supporting Caleb and Lily as they started their married life. It suggested that certain wedding expenses could establish an expectation of future family assistance. I leaned back in my chair and laughed. Not because it was funny, because it was unbelievable. Apparently, paying for one wedding had somehow become an argument for paying even more. I picked up my phone and called my attorney. David, he answered. I have a feeling this isn't a social call. You'd be right. I briefly explained the contents of the letter. There was a short pause. Then he said calmly, "Email it to me." Within minutes he had it. Less than an hour later, he called back. "I'll handle this. What do you need from me?" "Every invoice. Every canceled check. Every payment record related to the wedding. I already have copies. I'll send everything." Over the next day, we assembled a complete file. Every deposit. Every receipt. Every signed contract. Every vendor payment. Every single dollar was carefully documented. Nothing had been paid jointly. Every expense had come directly from my personal or business accounts. There was no confusion about who had financed the wedding. Once everything was organized, my attorney prepared a formal response. It was professional, respectful, and impossible to argue with. The package included copies of every payment I had made, along with a simple statement that summarized the entire situation. It read, "Mr. Morgan generously paid for the wedding as a voluntary gift. He has no continuing financial obligation to the couple, and considers this matter fully resolved. Before sending it, my attorney looked at me across his desk. Anything you'd like to add? I thought for a moment. Then I smiled. Just one thing. He waited. If I'm only a guest, I certainly don't owe anyone lifetime membership. He laughed. I think we'll leave that part out. Probably a wise decision. The response was mailed that afternoon. 2 days later, my phone rang. It was Caleb. His voice sounded different this time. Quieter, more thoughtful. Dad. Hey, son. There was a long silence before he finally spoke. I didn't know. Didn't know what? About the letter. I figured you didn't. I'm sorry. Those 2 words carried more weight than anything else he'd said in months. You don't have to apologize for someone else's choices, I replied gently. I know. Another pause followed. Then he admitted something that caught me completely off guard. I don't think Lily is the person I believed she was. I stayed quiet. He continued. I kept making excuses. I kept telling myself she'd eventually change. But lately, his voice cracked slightly. I'm starting to realize she's always gotten exactly what she wanted. I took a slow breath. It would have been easy to say, I warned you. It would have felt satisfying. But fathers don't win by proving their sons wrong. They win by being there when their sons finally see the truth themselves. I'm here, I said. For anything. We talked for nearly an hour. Not just about Lily. We talked about football, work, old family vacations, and the contracting business. For the first time in what felt like forever, it sounded like I was talking to my son again, not someone constantly trying to keep peace between 2 sides. After the call ended, Elizabeth appeared in the doorway with 2 cups of coffee. How did it go? I smiled. I think he's finally beginning to open his eyes. She handed me a mug and looked out the office window. Sometimes people have to learn things on their own. I nodded. Yes. And when they do, they finally understand the value of the people who never stopped standing beside them. Neither of us knew exactly what Caleb's next decision would be. But one thing had become clear. The cracks in his marriage were no longer invisible. And sooner or later, something was going to give. Nearly 7 months had passed since the wedding. By then, a quiet pattern had developed. Every Sunday, Caleb showed up at our house. Almost every Sunday. He came alone. Elizabeth and I never asked where Lily was. We welcomed our son the same way we always had, with good food, a cold drink, and a place where he didn't have to pretend everything was fine. One Sunday afternoon, while we were halfway through dinner, Caleb suddenly put down his fork. Neither Elizabeth nor I spoke. We could tell something was weighing heavily on him. After several long seconds, he finally looked up. I think I made a mistake. The room became completely silent. Elizabeth reached across the table but didn't interrupt. Caleb rubbed his hands together before continuing. I think I married someone I didn't really know. His voice was calm, but I could hear the disappointment behind every word. I kept believing things would get better. I thought once the wedding stress was over, she'd relax. I thought we'd eventually become the family I imagined. He gave a small, bitter smile. I was wrong. No one rushed to answer. Sometimes people need to hear their own words before anyone else responds. Finally, he looked directly at me. Dad, I'm sorry. I nodded slowly. I appreciate hearing that. He lowered his eyes. I should have spoken up at the wedding. Neither Elizabeth nor I said anything. I knew the seating arrangement wasn't right. I knew you and Mom deserved to be sitting at the front. I even thought about saying something. He sighed deeply. But I convinced myself it wasn't worth starting an argument. I studied my son for a moment. Why? He stared down at his plate. Because I thought keeping the peace was more important. I gently shook my head. Keeping the peace and avoiding conflict aren't always the same thing. He looked up. What do you mean? I folded my hands on the table. Real peace comes from honesty. If everyone stays quiet just to avoid upsetting one person, that's not peace. That's surrender. The words seemed to stay with him. He nodded slowly. I think I've been doing that ever since we got engaged. Elizabeth quietly reached over and squeezed his hand. No marriage survives if only one person is compromising. Caleb looked exhausted. I kept making excuses. I told myself she was just stressed. Then I blamed work. Then I blamed the wedding. Then I blamed money. He laughed softly, though there wasn't much humor in it. There was always another excuse. But eventually, you run out of excuses. Dinner ended much quieter than it had begun. After helping me wash the dishes, Caleb stood beside me in the kitchen. I don't know what happens next. You don't have to decide tonight, I replied. Just make sure the next decision is yours. He nodded. 11 days later. My phone rang. It was Caleb. I filed for separation. I closed my eyes for a brief moment. Not because I was celebrating. Because I knew how painful that decision must have been. I'm sorry you're hurting, I said honestly. So am I. Over the following months, I stood beside him through every difficult step. I went with him to meetings with his attorney. I helped him move into a smaller apartment. We spent holidays together when he didn't want to be alone. Some evenings we talked for hours. Other evenings we barely spoke at all. Sometimes simply having someone beside you says more than words ever could. People later asked whether I was happy the marriage had ended. The truth is more complicated than that. No father enjoys watching his son suffer. But I also couldn't ignore something else. The pressure Caleb had been living under was finally gone. Little by little, I saw the confident young man I had raised beginning to return. One afternoon, as we repaired the roof on my garage together, he looked over at me and smiled. Thanks for never saying, I told you so. I laughed. I thought about saying it. More than once. Oh, probably a few hundred times. He laughed for the first time in months. A genuine laugh. The kind that reaches a person's eyes. I'm just glad you found your way back, I told him. As we packed away our tools that evening, I looked across the backyard toward the house Elizabeth now legally owned. The fence I'd repaired countless weekends. The porch where our family had shared so many memories. Everything I'd spent decades building was still standing. Not because I had fought anyone, but because I had finally learned the difference between generosity and allowing yourself to be taken for granted. And in the end, that lesson turned out to be worth far more than $58,000. It's been over a year since Caleb's wedding. Looking back now, it almost feels like a different lifetime. The legal separation eventually became a finalized divorce. It wasn't quick, and it certainly wasn't easy. There were countless meetings with lawyers, difficult conversations, and more than a few sleepless nights. I stood beside my son through every step of it, not because I had all the answers, but because that's what fathers do. You don't stop showing up simply because life gets complicated. After everything was finalized, I received an unexpected phone call. The name on my screen read Brooks Turner. It had been many months since we'd spoken on the terrace during the wedding reception. "David," he said after I answered. "I heard everything." "So did I replied. There was a long pause before he continued. "I wanted to say I'm sorry." "For what?" "For not seeing things sooner." I leaned back in my chair. "Your daughter made her own decisions." "I know," he answered quietly, "but I also know I should have done more, not just financially during the wedding, as her father." Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Finally, he sighed. "She told me you were cruel for refusing to pay for that second trip." I smiled to myself. All I said was one word. "I figured there had to be more to the story," Brooks admitted. "There wasn't. Just no." He let out a small laugh. "If that's considered cruelty these days, the definition has certainly changed." I couldn't help laughing too. Before ending the call, Brooks said something I still remember. "Take care of Caleb." "I always will," I answered. That promise never changed. Months later, Caleb came over one Saturday morning to help me replace the roof on the garage. We worked side by side from sunrise until late afternoon, just like we had when he was a teenager learning the family business. Elizabeth brought us sandwiches for lunch, and our old dog spent most of the day trying to climb the ladder to join us. It was one of those ordinary days that somehow become unforgettable. After we finished cleaning up, Caleb and I sat on the tailgate of my truck, each holding a cold beer as the sun slowly disappeared behind the trees. Neither of us spoke for several minutes. Finally, Caleb broke the silence. "Thanks." I looked over. "For what?" "For never giving up on me." I smiled. "There was never a reason to. I made some terrible decisions." "You made human decisions. They're not always the same thing." He nodded thoughtfully. "I should have listened to you." "I wasn't trying to be right," I replied. "I just wanted you to be happy." For the first time in a long while, I saw the same confident smile I'd known since he was a little boy. Not forced. Not polite. Real. As we sat there watching the evening sky grow darker, my eyes drifted toward the backyard. The fence I'd repaired dozens of times. The porch where Elizabeth and I had shared morning coffee for years. The home we'd spent decades building together. Legally, the house now belonged solely to Elizabeth, exactly as we had planned. Our business was safely protected inside the trust. Everything we had worked so hard to create was secure. Not because I wanted revenge. Not because I wanted anyone to lose. But because I finally understood something that took me more than 50 years to learn. Kindness should never require surrendering your self-respect. Generosity should never become an endless obligation. And love should never be mistaken for unlimited access to someone else's hard work. Sometimes the strongest response isn't an argument. Sometimes it's a calm boundary. A single word. A thoughtful decision. Or simply refusing to let someone convince you that your sacrifices don't matter. People often ask me if I regret paying for that wedding. Surprisingly, I don't. The money is gone. But the lesson was worth every dollar. Without that experience, I might never have realized the importance of protecting everything Elizabeth and I spent our lives building. I also might have lost something far more valuable than money, my relationship with my son. Instead, we found our way back to each other. And that's worth more than any check I ever wrote. If there's one lesson my story leaves behind, it's this. Never confuse generosity with obligation, and never allow anyone to make you feel like a stranger in a place your hard work helped create. In the end, I didn't need revenge. I simply remembered one truth that had always been there. My house, my family, my values, my choice. And from that day forward, no one ever mistook me for just a guest again.